Hey guys, welcome to another video. This week, we're going to be picking up where we left off last time with the resignation of Richard Nixon. After Richard Nixon resigned, we're going to get into the Ford administration, the Carter administration of the late 70s, and the 1980 Reagan Revolution. Let's get started. So in August of 74, the United States is already in a deep economic crisis. We were in the energy crisis that's been caused by OPEC and the oil embargo, and nothing is getting better in the United States. Inflation is on the rise, and remember that thing we talked about before, stagflation, which is inflation is high, unemployment is high, and general economic activity is just on the downward trends. Stagflation is terrible. And what does Gerald Ford come up with to fight this on the domestic front? Well, he has an ingenious plan called WIN. That's all it does. Nothing. It's a button that you wear on your shirt, and it says WIN, and it stands for Whip Inflation Now. How are we going to whip inflation? Nobody knew how we were going to whip inflation, but we were supposed to wear the button that says we're in favor of whipping inflation. That's the extent of his policy. And people are like, is this for real? And not only that, but he's offered Nixon a full pardon for any and all crimes committed while he was president. And so Richard Nixon is off the hook. Whether he committed a crime or not, he's off the hook, technically and legally here. And Gerald Ford is just trying to get the country moving. Now, I'm not saying that there was anything wrong with Gerald Ford. We were in a very unique time in American history where things just weren't going well in pretty much any direction. And so he's going to try to maintain his name through his diplomacy and his foreign policy. So what is Gerald Ford's foreign policy? Well, his foreign policy is to take what Nixon had already done with détente and extend it and make it even more détente-ish by decreasing those feelings that are between us and the Soviet Union even more so. And he wants to sign a second SALT treaty. This one's known as SALT II. And the Soviets and the United States, we're going to meet. We're going to discuss this. But because of numerous factors, the Soviets just see Ford as weak and unable to really do anything through Congress or other means. And so they're just like, you know what? I think we're good. I think that, we're probably the one on the rise now. And the United States looks like they may be on the decline. So they were going to flex their powers. And just within a few short years, they're going to invade Afghanistan in an attempt to extend their regime and gain a port in the Arabian Sea. So now things aren't looking bad enough for Gerald Ford on the diplomacy front. We're going to officially lose the war in Vietnam in 1975. In 1975, which we've already covered in a previous video, this is the year that Saigon will fall in South Vietnam, and the communist forces will eventually take over the entire country of Vietnam and reunify Vietnam under a communist authority. And this is going to make the president look even worse. Not that this is his fault, because the Democrats in Congress are going to veto any attempt to either send in troops, money, or power of any kind to South Vietnam. But it doesn't matter whose fault it is. The president is always going to take the blame for whatever's going on during his tenure, because that's the way the people perceive it, that it's the president's fault. So with this, Gerald Ford and his administration is sunk. The 76 elections roll around, and Gerald Ford's performance was so poor, according to some, that this guy again, Ronald Reagan's going to run in the 76 presidential primaries and the Republican primaries to try to unseat Gerald Ford, to try to run against the Democratic nominee, who is going to be a black horse candidate, one that we hadn't heard of before, at least not unless you were from Georgia, and that's going to be Jimmy Carter.
He said his name was Jimmy Carter, and he was running for president. Then he laid out.
Jimmy Carter wins the election in 1976, primarily because he's not a Republican. People are sick of the Republican Party in part mostly because of Nixon's perhaps misdeeds in the Watergate scandal. And Gerald Ford didn't do a whole lot to redeem the Republican Party, and so people are ready for a change. Jimmy Carter runs his campaign as a promotion of human rights around the world. Jimmy Carter is basically saying, I want to do the right thing for people all around the world, not a focus on the Cold War, but more a focus simply on humanity and humanitarian means and ways to improve the world around us. Everything that Carter does, he tells us, he does it with the intent of promoting goodwill and humanitarianism around the globe. So let's take a look at some of those things that Jimmy Carter does while he's president.
The erosion of our confidence in the future is threatening to destroy the social and the political fabric of America.
So on the home front, Carter already realizes that we're in a serious economic depression. We are so bad off in the United States that a new measurement scale has to be developed to figure out how bad it is. And what this is called is the misery index. Yeah, it was that bad that we're rating our economy based on the misery that people are suffering through. Now, while Carter understands how terrible the economy is in the United States, he doesn't really have a plan to fix it. And I'm not sure if anybody had figured out a way that they could talk about how we could fix it, but Carter has to address it in some form or fashion. And what Carter is going to do is he's going to take some prime time airtime. He's going to address the American people in what's become known as the malaise speech. And what Carter does is not going to be received very well. He's going to give a speech, and he's going to tell Americans, he's going to tell us, he's going to tell the American people, you guys, the way that we've lived in the past, in the 50s and then to some extent in the 60s, that is over. We now have to learn how to deal with less, how to live a different type of life, because this is the new normal. Anybody who lived through this COVID nightmare of 2020, don't get me started on this thing called the new normal. But when you're going through something terrible, you don't want to be told it's the new normal. You want to be told that there are brighter horizons in the future and that this will all come to pass. And so Jimmy Carter's domestic policy doesn't bode very well with most Americans. However, on the foreign policy front, there's going to be a few brighter pages in the Carter administration. One of the things Jimmy Carter desperately wanted to do was to have a diplomatic victory overseas to make his presidency have some major accomplishments that could be pointed to in the 1980 election. Now, he's going to achieve this when he gets Israel and Egypt to sign a peace treaty, the Camp David Accords, in the early years of his presidency. Now, it takes a lot of effort on his part, but for a while, it looks like Carter is a diplomatic king. He is doing great things. He's bringing people together. He's a mover, he's a shaker. But then other things start to happen that make Jimmy Carter's foreign policy look like it's not as great as it was all cracked up to be. First of all, we have what's going to take place in Panama. For many years, Panama had protested the treaty that we had signed in 1903 that had given us the control over the Panama Canal Zone. Over the last few decades, there had been protests, there had been negotiations off and on, but Carter decided that the best thing in the United States' interest was to sign a new treaty which gave Panama back control of the Panama Canal Zone and gave them control over territory that had been under their autonomy before the Treaty of 1903 was signed. The actual implementation of the treaty is going to take place on December 31st, 1999, more than 20 years later. Now, of course, most conservatives were very much against giving away that territory, the Panama Canal Zone, back to Panama, who at the time, Panama was being pretty aggressive to the United States and was making a lot of threats. So this is going to be another feather in the cap for the Reagan campaign as he runs against Carter in the 1980 election. So in addition to that, communists are going to have a takeover in Nicaragua, another country in Central America, which is going to make things even worse in that region. You're going to have communist revolutions all across Latin America during this time period. And so the focus of the Cold War seems to be refocusing itself in Central America and Latin America, especially during the Reagan administration, which we'll get into here shortly. But before we get into that, another major issue of the Cold War breaks out when Soviet forces invade Afghanistan in 1979. Carter's response is limited, but one of the things that he does do is he tells United States athletes in the Olympics that they will not be able to participate in the 1980 games because those Olympic games are going to be held in Moscow, Russia. Now, a last and final slap in the face to foreign policy in the 1970s is going to take place in Iran. Now, Iran had been a fairly staunch ally of the United States and had been pro-American in its government and in its foreign policy. But in 1979, the Iranian Revolution breaks out and a very strict Islamic republic is going to be formed. So during this revolution in Iran, the Shah, the president of Iran, was overthrown eventually by extremists. Now, the extremists demanded to put the Shah on trial and probably wanted to execute him. And at this time, the Shah is actually in the United States undergoing cancer treatment. Jimmy Carter refuses to release the Shah back to Iran because he feels like it would be a violation of his human rights if he were to go back to Iran and be tried and eventually executed. Jimmy Carter gives the Shah asylum in the United States, which is going to infuriate the new government of Iran. At this time, there's going to be protests that go out of control, and they're going to overthrow and they're going to take over the United States Embassy in Iran. A total of 52 Americans were taken hostage by the Iranians and are going to be held for the next year against their will and in some cases in deplorable conditions. Carter will send one failed attempt to rescue the hostages, but afterward he's going to write letters and beg for the release of the Americans. These Americans will not be released until after Ronald Reagan is inaugurated on January 20th, 1981. Now, while the 1970s are not a particularly good time for Republicans, there's something that's going on during the late 70s, especially during the Carter years, that is a very big deal for Republicans, and that is the consolidation of the modern conservative right. Christians, economic conservatives, to an extent libertarians, and other groups, gun rights enthusiasts, anti-abortion activists, are going to form together a major coalition, and they're going to work together in 1980 to elect a president that is going to be emblematic of this new conservative movement. And this person, Ronald Reagan, he's going to win in one of the largest landslides in American history. Because, not just because of Jimmy Carter and the failures of the Carter administration, but because America was looking for something more than the 70s drag of stagflation and economic downturn. And Ronald Reagan promised Americans that there was a brighter day on the horizon, that there were things to look forward to, not just problems in our past that are going to be staying with us, but that things are going to change for the better, and America will become what it had been, and even more so. Ronald Reagan wasn't a young man when he became president. As a matter of fact, now he's the third oldest. At the time of his inauguration, he was the oldest president that we had ever had at 69 years old. Of course, Donald Trump takes that honor away from him. And then now, President Biden is the oldest president that we've ever had inaugurated at 78 years old and 61 days, just in case you're counting. So Ronald Reagan, when he was running for president, promised a lot of changes. Are we going to get those changes that he promised? Let's take a look at some of Ronald Reagan's domestic policy.
It is my intention to curb the size and influence of the federal establishment and to demand recognition of the distinction between the powers granted to the federal government and those reserved to the states or to the people.
Just a couple of months into office, Ronald Reagan is going to be shot by a man by the name of John Hinckley. Very strange situation. Look it up, Google it if you want to hear the details. It's a very strange story, all in all, which, by the way, that guy is out of prison now. I'm not sure if that's okay. But nonetheless, Ronald Reagan's going to have a lot of problems from that wounding. Now, he does recover fairly quickly, but some say that he suffered terribly after being shot at that old of age and the serious wounding of sorts. But Ronald Reagan makes it through, and Ronald Reagan is going to do his part into dramatically transform domestic policy. So one of the first things he has to do that he says will change the economy and bring us brighter days is tax cuts. He wants to lower the overall rates of taxes to help American businesses grow. Now, the term that people use is Reaganomics, because what Reaganomics is supposed to do is give major tax cuts, not just to the wealthy people. People always forget about the middle class, okay? Middle class and upper class tax cuts. Cuts in social spending, and it does lead to some economic recovery. By 1983, the American economy is beginning to grow at a rate that had not been growing in more than 2 decades. So the economy is starting to grow for the first time in a long time. And so whether you're a big fan of Reaganomics or not, they did work, and tax cuts do generally grow the economy. But that's not all that Reagan's going to do while he's president on the domestic front. To show his power, and going back to that law and order that we talked about with Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan says, we will have law and order in this country. And when the air traffic controllers of the United States go on strike for better pay, better working conditions, and so forth, Ronald Reagan says, you guys are imperative to the economy and the overall functioning of the United States. If you do not come back to work, we will fire every one of you and replace you.
This morning at 7 a.m., the union representing those who man America's air traffic control facilities called a strike. At one point in these negotiations, agreement was reached and signed by both sides, granting a $40 million increase in salaries and benefits. This is twice what other government employees can expect. Now, however, the union demands are 17 times what had been agreed to, $681 million. This would impose a tax burden on their fellow citizens which is unacceptable. Government cannot close down the assembly line. It has to provide without interruption the protective services which are government's reason for being. It was in recognition of this that the Congress passed a law forbidding strikes by government employees against the public safety. I must tell those who fail to report for duty this morning, they are in violation of the law, and if they do not report for work within 48 hours, they have forfeited their jobs and will be terminated. End of statement.
The air traffic controllers, for the most part, refuse to come back to work, and what does Reagan do? He fires them. You're fired. And so the air traffic controllers are going to be replaced, and Reagan is now going to be somewhat more respected, that when he says he's going to do something, he's going to do it. Another thing that Reagan does on the home front is he's going to appoint Sandra Day O'Connor to the United States Supreme Court, the first woman that's going to hold that position. Now, later on in Reagan's administration, you're going to have the famous Challenger incident, where the Challenger goes up to explore and explodes on the way into the atmosphere. And Reagan will become a soothing voice as he offers comfort to the United States for its major loss of astronauts, and in some cases even hope that we would further explore our solar system.
Today is a day for mourning and remembering. And I want to say something to the school children of America who were watching the live coverage of the shuttle's takeoff. I know it's hard to understand, but sometimes painful things like this happen. It's all part of the process of exploration and discovery. It's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave. We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them this morning as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God. Thank you.
Before we get into the foreign policy of Ronald Reagan, let's take a look at the 1984 election. Reagan is going to be reelected in one of the largest landslides in American history. Reagan carries all but one state in 1984. You don't really see that today too much in politics. Our country is so divided, I just don't know what to say. But Reagan is going to win the 1984 election, and that's going to give him renewed power and a renewed mandate to get some of the things done that he wants to get done. Remember, Reagan is working with a Democrat-controlled Senate and House for most of his presidency.
Behind me stands a wall that encircles the free sectors of this city. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
So what does he do overseas? As I mentioned earlier, communism is growing in Latin America. It's spreading from Nicaragua across El Salvador. It's growing across the entire Central and South American continent, and it looks like it's getting very much out of control. So what does Reagan, the anti-communist, want to do? He wants to help anti-communist fighters. He's going to fund Contras, those who are fighting against communism in Latin America. He's going to invade Grenada when communist forces from Cuba and around the world attempt to take over that small island nation off the coast of South America. As a matter of fact, some people say that Grenada in 1983 is kind of like our comeback from the Vietnam War. Now, of course, it's nothing like the Vietnam War. There's very few casualties, but it just shows that America is serious and we are going to stand up to communists around the world. And this shows our power and our commitment to that fight. Now, what Reagan's going to do with the Soviets is going to be very interesting, strange, and something that you could write movies about, because they have written movies about it. SDI, Star Wars, the Strategic Defense Initiative System.
Here, an artist's projection of the president's vision.
Banning into space, a layered defense to protect the country from nuclear devastation. U.S. spy satellites would watch the world below, detect Soviet missiles blasting off, compute the position and speed of each missile, alert battle stations in space, on Earth. The first response, space-based kinetic energy weapons fire high-speed projectiles from hypervelocity guns, intercepting enemy missiles as they are boosted through the atmosphere. Popped up into space, Earth-based nuclear-powered X-ray lasers fire their radioactive rays. Attack rays from land-based excimer lasers are redirected by huge mirrors orbiting in space. Chemical lasers fire beams that burn through the shell of the onrushing missile. Particle beam weapons with pulsing rays join the attack. Still over the atmosphere, the missile bus ejects its cargo, multiple nuclear warheads. As the remaining Soviet missiles now arc towards the U.S., ground-based projectiles are volleyed into space. Their giant steel ribs shatter the enemy weapons. The final minute. The surviving warheads enter the atmosphere above the United States, are attacked by laser-equipped planes. Earth-based lasers and ABM rockets eliminate the last warheads.
Reagan is going to toy with the idea of sending satellites into space that could float around the Earth and arm them with lasers that could shoot down any nuclear weapons that are coming from the Soviet Union. Now, did he think that could actually happen? Probably not. Did he think that something to bluff the Soviet Union into spending billions of their own dollars to try to catch up? Yes. Does it work? Yes. As a matter of fact, the Soviet Union is going to go bankrupt during this time toward the very end of the Reagan administration, After Reagan had called out in Berlin, Germany, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, end the Cold War once and for all, it's going to happen a year after Reagan leaves office.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
So, does Reagan end the Cold War? Some people say yes, it was absolutely Reagan. He won the Cold War. Some people say, well, he was a major player, but it was the work of all the presidents before him that all kind of combined together. I guess it depends on your perspective because we can't prove one way or the other. Before we leave the foreign policy front, we've got to talk about the biggest scandal that plagued the Reagan administration, Iran-Contra. Now, we've already talked about Iran. What's going on in Iran? The hostages. Well, they got released. But guess what? The Iranians are taking more hostages from various places around the world, more Americans, and the Contras are fighting against communist aggression. The Democrats in Congress say, no more money to fight this war. We're not going to give you any more money to fight communists. So Reagan says, let me see if we can find a way around that. Now, does Reagan actually say that? Or is that Reagan's people underneath him that are going to do this? The one that's going to take blame is Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, because what Oliver North is supposed to have been behind is strategically selling weapons to Iranians who are on the good side, and we're going to take their influence to help get our hostages released. They're going to hopefully help negotiate a release of our hostages that are being taken. And on the other side, we're taking that money from Iran and we're funneling it to the Contras to help buy them weapons and things of that nature to fight against communist aggression in Latin America. Now, since Congress had passed the Boland Amendment that said no more money to the Contras, Reagan is technically violating the Boland Amendment and they are threatening impeachment. But because of Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North falling on the sword and taking the blame, Reagan is going to escape most scrutiny, even though many Democrats say, I still think you did something here. But Reagan will escape unscathed for the most part, and his legacy lives on to this day. So what happens after Reagan leaves office? I've already told you that the Cold War is going to end. Anything else going to happen? Well, his vice president's going to carry on for another 4 years, George H.W. Bush. But we're going to cover that in another video. We'll see you then. Thanks for watching, guys.